Welcome everyone. This is the second in our three-part webinar series. We're exploring how leaders can better respond to an increasing and accelerating appetite for change. Ambiguity is what today is about. It's a word I've heard more and more over the last few years, with clients asking for consultants who are comfortable working with it. The coronavirus pandemic has only added to ambiguity in our worlds, which is why we're focusing on it from a change perspective today. So why it exists and how to overcome it. We were due to be in our studio today, as we were for our first webinar, but the new restrictions mean that we're dialing in from home instead. So let me introduce you to our guest panelists. So we've got Catherine Hayes, who's pretty much part of the furniture now here at Practicus. As many of you listeners will know if you've tuned into other webinars and events that we've done with Kath. She's a specialist in organisational change and culture transformation, and she has experience of leading large financial services, health and retail organisations through significant change. Kath has also been instrumental in taking Practicus through our own change journey over the last 18 months. Adrian Cottington is an IT director, transformation director and portfolio lead, who has just concluded a major piece of work for an insurance giant in the city. When asked what legacy Adrian left that organisation with, the board sponsor said, "He will be remembered for delivering the programme nobody was initially engaged with. He galvanised the leadership team and demonstrated the benefits of doing things with a clear purpose and appropriate governance." So in my view, overcoming ambiguity is probably Adrian's middle name. For those of you who don't know me, my name is David Webb, and I'm one of the directors here at Practicus, specialising in change transformation. We've got some structured questions lined up, but I'll be asking questions from the audience too. So please post those through the Q&A function on Zoom when you're ready, and we'll run until about 2 p.m. So without further ado, let's get started. So Kath, I'm going to start with you. And my first question is, why does ambiguity exist within organisations?
It's a very interesting question, I think, around ambiguity in organisations. In practice, if ambiguity exists inside organisations, it's a signal that your organisation is not joined up. Because if we look at the way in which the world is working, and my research over the last 20 odd years has shown that ambiguity is derived from the external environment. So if you have an organisation where you have ambiguity existing within your operational functioning, and people don't know and people don't have insight, it's a classic signal that things are not joined up. And if we look at organisations in general, the way in which they work is they're dependent on lots of different functions, different knowledge, different skills, different experiences. What I found is that high-performing organisations don't have ambiguity in their environments because they operate as a fully integrated system. If that makes sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. And Adrian, what's your view on that question?
I agree. Yeah. At the end of the day, what it comes down to is the fact that, as we'll come on to later on, I suspect, it's largely through internal factors that, there is confusion and ambiguity in organisations. And, we will touch on, as I say, but fundamentally it's the role of a leader to interpret the external environment to allow things to progress internally. And that's really important. So, people can read outside signals from, many ways, and that can lead people within organisations to go many different directions. So it's really important that, that leaders within organisations take those external signals, that the external environment, whatever it might be, and make sure they're properly interpreted, refined, and organised to make sure we drive in the right direction, the right purpose internally.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, we've already got a comment here, which I think I may as well pick up on as we're on the topic. So we've got a comment from John French, who says, I also think that ambiguity comes with the territory when working with change, not necessarily only when the organisation is not organised. Thoughts?
Again, it is the thing that we don't know what we don't know about change is until we step into the territory of trying to implement it or respond to it. And this is one of the things that I found was that, again, the change or the ambiguity is something you've not done before, yes, it does have an element of ambiguity associated with it. But when you've got integrated systems and when your organization is pulling together, then navigating ambiguity then starts to become a reasonable task to achieve, but also some organizations, and a lot of organizations I found over the years, is they can actually use that ambiguity as a competitive advantage in the marketplace. So it's the approach, it's the integrated approach to working with ambiguity. It is one of the key factors.
Fundamentally, we all live in a highly ambiguous world. I mean, we always have done, and it's it's even more ambiguous these days. And I think what this period has proven more than anything else is there are some organisations that specialise, in responding to ambiguity and benefit from it, and there are other organisations that haven't read the external signals as well as others and start to fail. Even the last couple of days with results from Marks and Spencer's, job losses at Sainsbury's this morning, you name it, Argos stores. Those kind of things are, I think, foreseeable. Certain things aren't going to be sustainable in the long term, whereas other businesses, and we all know them, have responded, and organised themselves to profit from an ambiguous external environment.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We've got another comment here from Peter Maddock, which I think we'll probably come on to. Well, I know we'll come on to this sort of subject later, but as we're going past it, he says ambiguity is much the same as the fog of war. Coming from military background, it is about establishing visibility and communications of that view. So I think we'll just note that for now, but I think we have a question that sort of points to that later. And also John says, thanks very much for your response. So I'm just going to go on to our second question, which naturally leads from the first. So so why is that ambiguity challenging for organisations? So what? Kath, again, I'll go with you first.
I've just noticed what's just popped up in the message, which Chris has just raised, saying ambiguity isn't the issue here. It's how capable the individual team and organisation are at dealing with it. In the differentiating factor, great teams do not eliminate ambiguity; they just deal with it better. And I think a great point, Chris, because this is one of the facts that I found was that quite a lot of organisations are still operating out of that old paradigm of simplicity and control, and it's derived from our Western mindset. So, building on Chris's point, we're not geared up in today's environment for being able to work with ambiguity and having the leadership capabilities, as we talked about earlier, for navigating environments of continuous change. We're set up, unconsciously, we're set up in our Western mindsets of needing clarity, simplicity, and with that comes control. So when we are faced with ambiguity and not knowing, leaders that have those inbuilt capabilities for being able to work with it and take their workforces on the journey are the ones that actually thrive. So it's a lot of what we're dealing with now is the kind of moving dimension of what's been happening over quite a number of years of how the environment of continuous change is starting to push up against the way in which we've always thought about how do you lead organizations, and typically how do you lead change. I mean, the classic one is the notion of the fact that change management, well, if change is a constant, which quantum physics keeps telling us, the whole notion of being able to manage change actually is a bit of an oxymoron, because the reality is we can't. We have to develop capabilities and support organizations to develop those capabilities for working with it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you very much. Obviously, I think we've sort of been talking around this point anyway, but in terms of why ambiguity is challenging for organisations then, so what is the knock-on impact of that? Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Adrian?
Yeah, I think in terms of knock-on impact, there is going to be a cost within the organisation to not managing ambiguity properly. It's going to be time, there's going to be effort. There's going to be confusion within the organisation. There'll be delays. So I think we talk about, and we'll come on to it, I think later on. We talk about ambiguity in fairly abstract terms sometimes if we're not too careful. But actually, all that will translate into negative impacts within the organisation. So this is not just a theoretical conversation about wouldn't it be nice to make things simpler and more straightforward in the organisation. There are very, very strong business reasons return on investment, workforce motivation, speed of delivery, cost, you name it, which are positive outcomes. So I think, and we probably all, I'm sure everybody who's listening in or watching have been there. When you have an organisation or a leader or a leadership team or a team that manages to navigate ambiguity well, things just happen. If they don't, then things quickly go downhill. So I think it's incumbent on all of us to recognise that there's a real business benefit of being honest about when ambiguity exists and having those honest conversations, which we often fail to have, to remove it, because sometimes it means that we might be challenging another part of the organisation. It might be challenging historical best practice, and all those things might need to be addressed to kind of get to where you need to be.
Yeah. Okay. Just before we move on to question 3 then, so just got a couple of other comments just to read out. Back to John French, says he's totally agree. The traditional response to ambiguity of measuring more and micromanagement actually makes it harder. And then we've also, I think through the Q&A function, we've got Simon Barclay. Hello, Simon. I agree with those saying ambiguity comes with territory and is almost always there. What problems is the organisation is self-ambiguous about its strategic direction. Yeah, I think that chimes with what we were saying. So I'm going to go on to our third question, which is to you initially, Adrian. So this is, how do leaders increase or encourage ambiguity? And I think the intention for us here was that's unintentional, maybe sometimes. But yeah, what was your view on that?
Yeah, I'm sure. I don't think anybody goes out to create ambiguity, but maybe they do.
Maybe they do. I don't
know. But I think it's one of those things really which we talk about. Some, as I did touch on earlier, we do talk about these kind of things sometimes a little bit theoretically and in the abstract. But actually what we're talking about here is leadership actions in relation to a change activity, and what things do leaders sometimes do, often, as you said, David, inadvertently, to really kind of create inefficiency and slow things down, when actually different actions could really create acceleration within the organisations, particularly if, as we said earlier on, managing ambiguity and being agile and nimble is the key to success going forward. So what we're talking about here to a degree is sponsorship. I think it goes much broader beyond that, but actually part of this is sponsorship as well, which is is patchy in many organisations. But I guess it's always good to kind of lay these things out in honest, straightforward terms, as opposed to theoretical. And I think there are probably 3 things, from my experience, and I'd be great to get thoughts in from everybody else. Actually, 3 things that really I found personally have led to inefficiency and ambiguity. One is really kind of absolving their personal responsibility for agreeing and championing the purpose of any change activity across the broader organisation. I think an analogy I would use is a bit of a pat on the back at base camp, set him up the mountain, and then meet him at the summit. And that's just not how things can work anymore, really. So I think it's really incumbent on any sponsor leader to really work hard at making sure that the purpose of the project is understood and it's properly accepted and socialised across any organisation to reduce any resistance. Second thing I think is really failing to help the programme teams or the change teams navigate the programme through volatile times. Every programme that we've all of us ever worked on, will hit a rocky patch. We all know that. And it's really important more than anything else to make sure that leaders are working closely day in, day out with the change team to help them navigate through those, rather than assuming everything would be great and we'll get to the original destination eventually, without too much intervention. So I think intervention, closeness, especially as I say in this new world where we are working more remotely, having real closeness to the team is really important. I think the third thing, actually, I see it a lot, is even though there's a real kind of focus of change priority in the organisation, often the best people aren't allocated to it. Quite often, people are brought in from outside. They might be good people nonetheless, but they won't understand the context of the organisation. And there might be, there will always be some excellent SMEs within the organisation, that create the shortcut to rapid change. And they're often so important for BAU operations that they're not used on change teams, which creates huge inefficiency. So yeah, I think they're the three things. Leaving it to change team to secure the purpose, failing to help the change team navigate difficult circumstances, and not allocating the right expertise to a programme to get it to its endpoint as quickly as possible.
Okay, thank you. And Kath, what's your view on that question?
Completely agree. I think one of the interesting things you get in organisations is what I term as splitting. So they take the change as being a thing that is something that is completely different to the organization. So as Adrian was pointing out, instead of bringing internal people, or instead of bringing a number of like-minded individuals together and get a diversity of thought and get input and start to bring different perspectives together to look at that change through different lenses, there's quite a big temptation to say, oh, let's set up a change team that will be completely separate from the organisation or the business agenda, and we're going to outsource the change process to that change team. But of course, then what they've done is they've actually separated and split that away from the way in which the business is functioning. So, you know, change teams can become very isolated in terms of how they engage with the organisation and how the organisation engages with them. So, of course, then when you have more of that splitting, then you get this factor of naturally ambiguity will emerge, because people are not sharing information. They're not being able to see the world through diverse lenses of the levels of being able to work with the different types of complexity. And of course, then what you start to get, and just building on some comments that were made by Peter and Georgina, you then start to get political dimensions of people having very different worldviews, because the leaders have not, going back to Adrian's point, the leaders have not held the system to be supportive of the change process as a whole. They've outsourced it, whether it's, you know, whether they've brought in a contractor to do it or whether they've just outsourced it to a separate team. They're not holding the system to be able to navigate the way in which the change is emerging.
Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned a couple of people that have commented. So let's actually go back to those then before we move on. So yes, Peter Maddox says, how do you get around the politics and ignorance of internal politics which create ambiguity as much as when the drive and determination is there?
Again, this goes back to knowing how the organisation works. You know, in a classic, as we started off this conversation, in a classic about saying that there's ambiguity inside the organisation, if you've got politics, 9 times out of 10, that relates to fear-based cultures. In my experience, and again, I've been researching this for over 20 years, politics emerge when people don't feel safe and they don't feel connected. So when you start to see political behaviours, and typically these will be the move towards, so a lot of game playing and a lot of yeses and a lot of big nods, but actually nothing gets followed through. Or you might get the move against strategy, where people start using the power of their positions to start to force things and push things through. Or you get the move away strategies where people just don't engage at all, don't turn up for meetings. Any of those behaviours you start to see will tell you that there's fear in the system, which will be an indicator of the fact that there is ambiguity and that people are not being able to connect with the type of change and the processes that are going on.
Exactly right. And I love Georgina's point, actually. I was reading that, actually. And my background before I became an independent consultant, I worked for one of the larger UK retail banks. I won't say too much which one. But in my experience, you know, the point Georgina makes is spot on, actually, because what generally happens is that the kind of the subtleties, the detail was lost because people are driven towards an outcome by a certain point in time, and that tends to be, you know, only prevalent in certain types of organisation and not others. And maybe it's more prevalent in banking, but, you know, whereby an outcome from a project is linked to an annual remuneration cycle or objectives, as opposed to the realities of a project and its outcomes. And those subtleties are missed, and it's often the organisational construct itself that almost makes it a taboo to talk about these things. And actually, my more recent experience as Dave said in Assure is completely reversed, which is, you know, sponsorship based on trust, on interaction. So it does link back to leadership, and I think strong leadership, absolutely, as Georgina says, is linked to understanding that the world is an uncertain place, always has been, always will be, and the devil is in the detail, you know. And the worst thing that can often happen is to ignore when things are going off track, and then when it gets to the end of the year, trying to find a scapegoat, you know, which often happens in large organisations that are very set around an end date. That's a great point, Georgina. Thank you.
Thank you. So I won't read them all out individually, but we've had some comments of agreement from John French, Andrew Garner, Fabiola, So thanks for those. It's good to know that we're not talking nonsense. That people think we're talking sense. That's good. And you've obviously already mentioned Georgina's question. So there is one more from Dave Knight, which I'll ask now as well. So is ambiguity ever a good thing? For example, could it enable greater creativity?
Absolutely. And that's what I found is that high performing organizations that are comprised of integrated systems will utilize the ambiguity of the external environment to generate new and different. And they'll use it from a perspective of, oh, that's new, or that's unknown, or, oh, hang on a minute, there's a gap in the market. And I watched this when I was in my full-time employment in investment banking. If there were products that weren't created in the environment, or there were gaps or holes in regulatory requirements that a new product could be created, they would utilize it and they would generate a lot of revenue from it. So absolutely, ambiguity can be utilized as a huge competitive advantage for organizations as long as they're willing to engage with it. But it makes it very difficult that when they're not connected and when they're not working together as an integrated factor, they can't then leverage the ambiguity in the external environment to generate and create new and different.
Yeah. I guess the opposite of ambiguity is certainty,
Yeah.
Which in my experience never happens. So a degree of ambiguity is important because no one's really quite sure what the end product looks like. So long as you've got a change life cycle that's built on experimentation, taking a risk, and rapid course correction if you need it, I think it's got to be a good thing.
Absolutely.
Okay. And we just got one more. I'm just going to ask one more before we move on to the next structured question. So this is again from Peter Maddock. He says, we talk about leadership often, but what about followership? Now, I'm not quite sure what he means there, but I don't know if you two might have a view on that.
Again, when we talk about fellowship, are you following the leaders? Are you following the organizational agenda? In my experience, it's rare these days that organizations are, led by one guy or one lady running from the front and come on, boys and girls, over the top. My experience is that fellowship is connected when you've got, as Adrian pointed out, clearly defined purpose. When people's hearts and minds feel like they can connect to what the organization is all about, they will follow it because they will feel as though they're part of it. But I think going on the days, particularly in large organizations, where fellowship of leaders has to come with an integrated approach and a clearly defined purpose and a clearly defined strategy as to where that organization is intending to going and what it's all about, basically.
Yeah. You don't do it just because they're the leader. You
No.
have to understand. No. Okay.
No.
Adrian, anything from you on that?
Nothing more to add to that.
Nothing more. Okay. Well, our next question we have already covered, at least in part, which was how can we overcome ambiguity? So I think we've referenced a few things, but maybe not gone into detail. So is there some more detail you can add around that?
It's a few things for me. I just wanted to mention that I think from just a personal view of what works well to manage ambiguity. As I say, from my background as a portfolio director, and one is to make sure the change journey is really well set out. And not in terms of a project plan or all those traditional things, but the actual journey. What are we seeking to achieve, and what are we going to actually deliver all the way through that, all through that journey. I think it's important to really have those transition states mapped out all the way through. So what are the points that we as a leadership team, I'm talking about the leadership of the business, not the change organisation, are going to stop, reflect, make sure we're heading in the right direction, course correct where we need to, all those things that are going to happen. So it's important to really engage, organizational leadership, through those transition states. And I think also it's really important to make sure, and I'm not going to get diverted onto agile or waterfall, I'm not talking about that. It's really important to structure a program so that it delivers a value all the way through. The old fashioned way of doing things, would be that you would put in 80% of the effort before you get to any of the value that's delivered from it. And it's really important, no matter what kind of program it is, be it risk reduction, efficiency, product development. It's really important to really focus on delivering as much value throughout the life cycle as early as possible, and being prepared to change direction, change course all the way through with the right level of engagement. And that's not easy to do. It's really easy to describe it, but actually getting to a point where you structure let's say a 3-year journey into delivering value all the way through, so that the level of investment you're putting in as much as possible is getting paid back as soon as possible is very difficult. But my experience, rather than setting off on a sprint and ignoring that particular equation, it's worth spending the money and time up front to make sure you've got a well-structured 3-year roadmap. So that's certainly my experience.
I'll remember that if you become a client, Adrian. So remember to spend the money at the beginning. Kath, have you got any
value? Yeah.
You got any comments on that?
I think what Adrian is pointing to is change really is an iterative process, and I completely agree. Another thing that can fix projects or even organizations into is what I call a methodology mindset. People become, the latest one at the moment is agile. They become so focused on trying to follow the methodology that they can't take the incremental approach because they're hoping that the methodology is going to achieve the outcomes. And I think it is an iterative process. We don't know what we don't know until we take a step into starting to execute a plan or an approach. And we have to be completely open to the fact that, given we don't know, we're going to be experiencing things that are going to be coming out of left field or coming out of the woodwork that we hadn't anticipated. And it's about then how flexible we are to be able to incorporate those different dynamics as they emerge, as Adrian says, on the journey. But it's when people start to get fixated on the plan, that everybody's thrown out waterfall as being, following steps 1 to 10. But all we've done is swapped apples for pears when it comes to things like agile. A lot of people are very focused on the method, and it really is about being aware and picking dimensions up as they emerge along a journey with the focused intent of what outcome are we trying to achieve and getting that clear.
Yeah, okay. So I've got a couple of comments and questions from Georgina Wistow. Hello, Georgina. So she says, often in that period where the old is no longer relevant and the new is not established, groups and individuals will excel in this space to move quickly to solutions. The change leader then has to have, sorry, my screen just moved as I was reading it. The change leader then has to have the strength and awareness to work with those organic developments within their own change agendas. So what's your comment on that comment?
Which kind of builds on what we were just talking about, being iterative and being open to the fact that you don't know what's going to come up until you start to implement it. And again, that if everything gets fixated on the fact that the pathway is being clearly defined and that you're not going to diverge from the pathway because of these different dimensions, because no, we're going this way, it's my way or the highway. And a lot of that, we start to see it, that comes through control bias leadership practices. Leaders thinking that they can control and manage the outcomes because they've got a clearly defined plan. And this is direction of travel that we're going in, and that happens quite a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. And that's a good link actually to Simon's point, actually, which I'm just looking at now, actually, about
engineering organisations.
Yeah, exactly right, because. So, like I was saying earlier on, I would expect over a, let's say, 2 or 3 year strategic change journey, which is often the case, there's going to be 6 or 7 probably transition states through that period where if you try and think hard enough about the structure of a program, you can stop the program at each of those points, and the level of value you get from it exceeds the investment. That's what you've got to really strive for. And it's difficult, very, very difficult, but it's what we've got to strive for. And actually, the danger is obviously, as Simon's saying, it's not a danger, but obviously with engineering, it does strive for, 0 defects, which is absolutely right, particularly in software engineering. But I think the world's changing, or has changed already, really, in my experience, where you're right, it is about, but also I think engineers are also excellent researchers as well. And often the key to research is getting things wrong and then finding the right way as a result. So I absolutely agree with Simon's point, but I think, as long as people accept that, things do go wrong, things will fail, and that's not a bad thing. it's basically an indicator of you need to do things differently, or you need to do things better, or change how you're approaching it. That's got to be a good thing. So obviously with software in particular, it's important you do, get the defects down to a level that is totally acceptable to the business and protect you from things like cyber risk and all those kind of important things.
Yeah.
But I think also the journey to get there has to involve failure. It has to involve getting things wrong. And it comes back to leadership, which is saying, hey guys, sometimes or often things go wrong is a good thing because we've learned a lesson. And that's got to be a good thing as long as we benefit from that and we don't stick rigidly to where we were going before.
Yeah, cool. All right. And the other point from Georgina was, do we need to overcome ambiguity or move to acceptance and think about how we build transparency, fortitude and agility / trust?
I think that's the point, isn't it? It is developing the capability to work with it, and building on what Georgina was saying earlier. There's also this factor of being willing to say that, and a lot of leaders don't like doing this because they like to be seen to be all-knowing, but admitting they don't know what they don't know, and being able to be honest that it is an open pathway while we can set the agenda and while we can set our outcomes in some context. That being open that the journey will be ambiguous, and therefore creating integrated infrastructures to support people to work through it is absolutely key. Another factor that comes in as well, and I see this quite a lot in organisations, is they don't understand how they're functioning. They don't have depth of insight into knowing and understanding in practice how do their organisations work. So when they start stepping into unknown territory without knowing, if something's working really well, how do we maintain that? How do we keep that? If something's not working well and we're challenged by it, let's get the drains up and let's understand what that looks like before we then start stepping into trying to change something that we're going to either unintentionally take the legs off what's already working or make what's not working even more dysfunctional. So I think one of the key factors for really, navigating ambiguous territories in organisations is to really have depth of insight into how the organisation functions.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, exactly right. David, I was just reading actually Chris's point about COVID. Actually, it's a good one actually. And it's funny actually. I'm fairly neutral about this one actually because I think it depends on the organisations you may have worked in. Where you've worked in the past, in terms of what it actually really means. I think, in many respects, for those, for many people who might have worked in, larger multinationals before, like, global banks or whatever, actually, people have been working remotely for years, actually. And it's like a duck to water in many sense. And I don't know, other organizations often, from my experience, maybe recently, UK London market insurance firms are very much UK based in many cases, and people used to being in the office together. That's a bit more of a cultural journey. So I think it depends on the kind of organization you come from. So when I was in banking, I had a team of about just over 200 people, and I was the only person in the UK. Everybody else was in the US, East Coast, India, and Singapore, and Lithuania. I might see them, once or twice a year, but fundamentally day to day, it was the same format. This is 5 years ago now, as we are today. Obviously not Zoom. We never heard of Zoom 5 years ago. Show and bought shares then, I guess, really. But fundamentally, but conversely, some people aren't. So I think that what's really important, the point I was coming to really is, we shouldn't assume because some of us are used to working remotely that other people are, because it can be both from a pure change process perspective and also from a well-being perspective very, very challenging for people. And we can't forget the human factor as well. So I'd say in terms of change processes and running remote sprints or that kind of stuff remotely, that is relatively straightforward. But the real thing for all of us is to really treat people as people and understand how they operate effectively, or where they might find challenges individually. And I think that's probably where leadership has changed. It's gone from being a responsibility for the collective to a responsibility for the individual. I think it always has been, but now more than ever, it's really important. So my take on Chris's question is, I think it's important as long as we as leaders manage at an individual level, not as a collective level solely.
Yeah.
It's not a process. It's not a methodology issue. It's a leadership issue and how we manage our teams.
Well, I'm glad you picked up on that, because that was also on my list of questions to ask. I think just me picking up on your point there, Adrian. So I spoke to a contact of mine who works for a nuclear power generation organisation, and the COVID pandemic accelerated their remote working infrastructure and process plan by about 3 years, and they had to do it within a matter of days because there was no option. And after a few bumps in the road, actually that's been a really good thing for them. And similarly, I spoke to the CIO of a university on the outskirts of London that we've worked with. It was the same thing. It was their long-term ambition. And to your point, not everyone is used to working from home. Or they weren't before. Maybe they are now. Okay. So just in the interest of time, I see we've had some other comments. So thank you very much for those, David and Peter. And John and Chris again. But I'm just going to go on to the fourth question, which again I think we've touched on, but I think there's more detail to be had, which is, what are the characteristics of organisations which thrive through periods of external ambiguity, and that includes leadership characteristics? So again, Adrian, I'm going to start with you on this.
Yeah, I think we've touched on this quite a lot already, if I'm honest, David. Yeah. But it might probably worth quickly reiterating them. So I do, and I think it's probably also confirmed in some of the comments, like from Peter, etc., on the chat. But it is about setting out a change journey, and and having those nodes throughout that journey to really ask yourself those honest questions. Are we heading in the right direction? Is this what we want? What else should we be doing? Can we capable and afford to do it? Rather than blindly continuing towards an outcome which you may not want in the long term. It is about really kind of engaging the influential people within the organisation on that. It's pretty common in my experience for a project to create a governance ecosystem that consists of the wrong people, unless the decision makers within the organisation are engaged in those forums and in the decision making. It just won't work, and that's that's a common failing actually in my experience, which is that the wrong people are put in the wrong places in the decision making aspects of a change program. You have to have the organizational leaders, the right people front and center making those decisions, otherwise it just won't happen. And as I said before, I guess it is about iterative value throughout the journey, and making sure that value that you deliver throughout that journey as much as possible exceeds the investment you put in.
Okay, thank you. Kath?
I think you raised a really interesting point, Adrian, about the skills. One of the factors that's overlooked is the capabilities required as opposed to skills and knowledge. And are those capabilities being matched? If you've got a complex project, you really do need people who can relate to different people, not necessarily a technical subject matter expert who's has a particular discipline in a particular SME area. So I think it's requiring and thinking about what's the nature of the change journey you're about to embark on. What are the core capabilities that you need to be able to do that? What are the people you've got to take on board as part of that journey, so that you're not self-isolating yourselves and that agenda from the way in which the business is working? Because the other factor that can often happen is when people get very stuck on that journey and where they're going with it, things can start emerging in the environment that become new and different, but those factors are not taken into consideration because the decision has already been made and the journey has already been mapped. So that iterative approach and that bringing things together and the core capabilities that you need to deliver on it are absolutely essential.
What about, I mean, this is not a question we've got structured, it's coming from the audience, it's just come from my head. So when I think about the last 6 months, obviously it's been a very strange, 7 months, it's been a very strange time. So we talked about iterative improvement and governance and leadership, but through the last 6 months, a lot of companies have struggled and had to overcome this difficulty, but other people really have thrived. And for me, what I was thinking was there must be some creative spark within those organizations for people to be thinking, okay, there's a load of bad stuff happening here, we need to keep the wheels turning. But is there someone within that organization that has to have that, that more strategic, creative view that isn't necessarily involved in firefighting? Is that a characteristic or not?
I think kind of I think what I would bring it down to is being able to translate customer insight and need into rapid action. Because we tend to get, I guess, more focused on retail business rather than anything else, because that's probably the domain that's suffering more or impacting more than anything else, in the current world that we live in. But it is that kind of deep understanding of your kind of customer base's needs and their changing needs, and really translating that rapidly into new products, change products, whatever it might be, a new service offering, could be anything, I guess, really. And that for me is the key to it, really, David. And so that be, and many organisations, they might have a good view of customer insight. By the time they've responded to it, the world's moved on. Whereas those organisations that are really successful now, their life cycle to go from customer need to release could be a matter of weeks or a couple of months. And that comes down firstly to really investing, in understanding your customer, not maybe to the extent that Facebook have done, maybe. I think that's getting customer insights at the extreme, but really understand your customer and what their needs and wants are, and being honest about how you relate those changing needs and wants to your product offering, and then being nimble and agile enough to change it and being honest enough to change it. As I said earlier on, we could have all have predicted, I think, wow, Argos are closing. Wow, that's a surprise. That's always going to happen. Hadn't responded to the changing world, right? And others have done. For me, it does. I'm sure there are many, many other factors, but customer insight translated into rapid change and product release, which, as Catherine absolutely bang on said earlier on, comes down to an organic and iterative change ecosystem, not one which is based on massive change juggernauts that take a long time to deliver.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think that takes us on to our next question quite nicely. But before I do that, I'm just going to go to a question from Chris Hallam. He says, given that so much of what we talk about in change and transformation relates to the human interactions, do you feel that we give enough emphasis to emotional intelligence in how we lead change?
That's a great question.
Kath, go with you first.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting one, isn't it? The whole EI thing, emotional intelligence. But as we were talking about it earlier, emotions that come up as a result of change, can either, some people can be incredibly excited by the thought, going back to what Adrian was talking about, of new and different and creating new and different. And for others, the whole notion of you just changing something that is the norm, or might be changing something that is the norm, is an absolute terror, and the whole world's gone to hell in a handbasket. So I think there's these aspects that are associated with the nature of the relationship that people have with ambiguity and change is absolutely, essential. And also from a leadership point of view, just because as a leader you may not be suffering any kind of anxiety associated with not knowing, people around you may. So I suppose my question around it is much more around, yes, I might be having an emotional reaction to it, but what's the nature of my relationship that I have with ambiguity, and how is that similar and how is that different to the people around me? And I think that's more about, we can all say, yes, I understand my emotional impact, but what impact does that have on my behaviour? What impact does that have on my colleagues and the people around me? And what impact does that have on a broader environment? And my experience is the more emotional reactions you have that are toned from the fear dimension, the more fear you have, the less likely the environment and the people are going to likely to want to engage when they're up to their eyeballs in, oh God, I don't know, and what am I going to do, and how am I going to approach this? So I think, the whole physical, emotional dimension of how people process this stuff and the nature of the relationships that we have with it is absolutely key.
Yeah, and I'm just putting on what Kath was saying. I genuinely think the current environment, which is not going to change massively, will need us to redefine how we do, how we operate as leaders and how we do that. And emotional intelligence will become probably the most important part of our toolkit, because emotional intelligence basically comes down to when people say they agree with you and they really don't, or they say they're happy and they're not. Your job as leader is to guide people through a really kind of challenging period or program or whatever it might be, and to really get to the bottom of how effective they're being and what they need to do, and work at a very personal level. And I think this remote working environment could or will potentially make that harder, and people start to pay lip service to it, having I'll have a virtual coffee with you, all that kind of stuff. So I think my personal view is that it's something which we have to put more effort into than anything else. I think it's a really great point actually about the importance of emotional intelligence, because and everybody's different. Some people are very emotionally aware and read other people's feelings pretty well. Other people less so. We're all different. We're all individuals, and everybody's different. But I think it will redefine what a good leader is, because you need to be able to work remotely, operate far less frequently with face-to-face contact, but still have that rapport, that relationship, and read people, understand their feelings. And it's really important. And I wish if I could do that, and I'd bottle it and sell it, and probably wouldn't work for a long time. But unfortunately, it's not the world. So I think it's a really important point. And from my experience, I can't understate enough how important that is in the future world.
Okay. I think this next question from John French is also really good. So he says, do you think that resilience as a capability is sufficiently invested in to support our leaders? And the reason I like that personally so much is that over the last probably year within Practicus, that the word resilience has become more and more important and used. And we actually, we have our own values and culture and behaviours that we focus on. And that has sort of come into that equation much more than it did before, and the last 6 or 7 months has been tough. So that resilience factor has become much more important. So thanks for asking that, John. What do you think about that, Kath and Adrian?
I think when we use the term resilience, it has many different connotations. I think my example of resilience is that your organisation and your infrastructure are self-supporting of each other. That people are seen as human beings, they are engaged with as human beings, as Adrian was talking about, how getting to know people and understanding that. I've seen a lot of organizations, when they talk about resilience, is they send a whole bunch of people on a resilient training program. You've come out the other end of it, and now you're resilient, and whenever we chuck at you, therefore you will be able to overcome that. And it isn't about that at all. It's about building self-supporting infrastructures where you've got mutuality-based environments where people are seen as human beings and they're supported as human beings, rather than told or controlled or being made to have to put up with the fact that the leadership context or the change context is complex and messy. Yeah, let's own it. Let's work together on that. Let's all come together and and own the fact that yes, it might be complex. Yes, it might be ambiguous. But for me, resilient environments is where people are seen and supported as human beings for who they are and what they are.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Adrian, anything else from you?
Yeah, it's funny something what Kath was saying did resonate actually, because it depends how you define resilience. Because in some way, kind of resilience you could take it as meaning that you're good at operating within a tough environment, or it could mean you've created a robust but actually mutually supportive environment where people it is resilient because people feel supported and under threat. I think so. Resilient for me could have a negative and a positive thing. So I think resilience can be a dangerous thing sometimes. What I mean is that we all have like a surface strength where we're absolutely fine, we'll crack on, no problem at all, and that could be defined as being resilient. But actually, everyone has their limits, right? Everybody has their limits. So I think we have to, in this new world, be really attuned to that. And that's why I go back to my point about working at an individual level, not a collective level all the time. As leaders, we must do both. But I can't really kind of support Kath enough in the comment she was making, which is what we have to do is create environments which are resilient. And resilient environments in the go forward world will be based on EQ, as we said earlier on. It will be based on mutual support. It will be based on heavily investment in employee well-being, training managers to kind of work, to be leaders, not just managers in a remote environment. So resilience is going to be very much a collective self-supporting ecosystem going forward, as opposed to being tough during tough times.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So we've got about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to go into question 6. And again, we've covered this in part, but I'm sure there's more that we can hear as well. So how should change leaders or functions adapt to overcome ambiguity, Kath?
Again, I think we pretty much quite covered a lot of those topics. I think it is about being mindful of what are you putting your attention into. Are you being mindful of that? Yes, organizations are comprised, and high performing organizations especially, are comprised of integrated systems that mutually support one another. That then builds on what we're just talking about. It builds resilient infrastructures. So when you've got resilient infrastructures and in practice, you don't have unnecessary ambiguity within that existing environment, therefore people come together, they're galvanized as a systemic whole, which means that then how the environments work and how they emerge can be taken iteratively over time. So there are a lot of the concepts that we've talked about today, that when you've got those integrated infrastructures, you generate that kind of sustainable capabilities for being able to navigate complex territories, regardless of whatever it is in the external environment.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And Adrian?
Yeah, I think for me, it's just not create massive change juggernauts that are impervious to changes in the external environment, firstly, and secondly, to see their role as the filter. As a leader in the organisation, your role is to continually scan the external horizons and landscape, interpret it for what it means for your organisation, and explain it to your teams in terms that make sense to them. As I said earlier on, people can interpret signals many different ways, depending on their value set, and then head off in many, many different directions. So for me, kind of taking those external signals to create a common purpose and to steer the organisation based on that is really important.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. So the last question I've got on my list is, how should you structure a team to be successful? And Adrian, I'm going to go with you first.
Okay, all right, cool. So one of my golden rules actually is never to use the word resource, because often it's a bit of an abstract term, and it's a bit of an excuse for not knowing what you need, how many of what you need, and what capability you need, what capacity you need, because it's just I need more resources is a massively overused phrase in any business. And actually, I say, for me, it's a massive get out. So for me, using that word in any project environment, if you really focus your team on talking about capability, skills and capacity, then you always get to the right answer. And for me, that's the hub, that's the nub of it really, which is not talking about resources or numbers in the abstract sense, but to really understand where your change journey is taking you and what capabilities you need through that journey. And actually, they will probably change as you go through. And it's not just about the traditional change skills, there's also subject matter expertise as well. So just it's a very personal view, right? Which I'll put out there and people can shoot me down, is for me, the best change teams tend to be smaller. They tend to be highly skilled people, not too many consultants. So I'm not talking about building a team of consultants here. It's talking about a small, multi-skilled team. People who have got delivery experience, but also have very strong subject matter expertise in the topic they've got. That also have got the right behaviours and also that bind together as a team as well. Because fundamentally we're talking about here people working well together. So you can throw as many business analysts, project managers, whatever, together in a big team, and hope it all works. But unless you really focus on the relationship side of things and get people working well together, then ultimately that's going to put your program in difficulty. So therefore, having a smaller team of like-minded, highly skilled delivery people that can change direction and understand the external environment as well. So that it's not just the role of leaders to read those external signals and change direction. It's also, having the right people internally to help you with that as well. So for me, it comes down to smaller teams, iterative change, multi-skilled, with strong individuals. So smaller is better. Okay.
Kath, what do you think about that?
I agree with everything that Adrian says. I think the thing that I would also add to that, the thing that galvanizes teams is having purpose. And the thing that really will make teams come together is knowing what they're there for and the purpose they're contributing to the organisation. And so, you know, building a lot on Adrian's points about, yes, it's about relationships, it's about bringing people together. It is about having that, you know, that purpose creates a unifying context for that team to come together. And it can have a huge impact on the way in which, not just the way in which the team works, but also how it relates to its stakeholders, how it relates to bringing people on board, how it relates to then creating that context we were talking about before of how do you utilize ambiguity as an advantage to create new and different and facilitate innovation.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. So we've got at least another couple of questions from the audience to take us up to, I think, the end of our time, most likely. I'll squeeze in another one if I can. So we've got one from Scott Cormis. Hello, Scott. On a few occasions, more than two, apparently, I have found myself involved in a large change management effort with ambiguity clearly designed into them. I think this insulates and protects leadership in the event things don't go to plan. And in doing so, almost ensures underperformance. Anecdotally, I'd say a majority of senior stakeholders aren't equipped or understand the success factors or how to manage a transformation. Have you found that?
Absolutely, 100%.
Yeah.
I can't say any more than that, really.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Never a true word was said. Yeah, I think, you know, it is really important, because at the end of the day, any executive, generally speaking, is driven on, you know, they are motivated and remunerated based on their ability to drive change in the organisation, which is why it's doubly shocking, as Scott says, that many leaders in the organisation have come up with operational routes to understand transformation. So the last organisation I was with, you know, in the city, a London market firm, invested heavily in training the board and executive committee on transformation and change, and it paid dividends. Absolutely paid dividends.
Okay.
Absolutely. There's also the intent. What's the intent behind having deliberate ambiguity? Well, typically it means people can't be held to account. And you see this quite a lot. You see this quite a lot with the regulators, how they come in with a very ambiguous requirement that organisations have to respond to. And then it means that if the organisation or another different organisation produces something that's slightly out of kilter, then the regulators can't be held to account for what the organisation is or isn't doing. So yes, I think that's normally done with a deliberate intent, that fact that people who are leading something will not be held to account for a particular delivery. So yes, I think it's shall we say, a political agenda when we have that.
I remember that.
Thank you. So the last question I think that we have time for is from Andrew Garner. He says, should we always have business SMEs, subject matter experts, embedded in the change delivery team? Take them out of their day job to be 100% accessible technical guys?
Not necessarily, I don't think. So it goes back to my earlier point, actually, which is if you build capability in your team, you know, which is really focused on the product that or the service you're delivering, then the people in the team can engage effectively with the SMEs in the business. If you fill your team with people who haven't got that experience, that background, then that relationship doesn't happen. So my experience has been, you know, a number of times now, actually, which if you have the right people in the change team that have the right background and awareness and knowledge of the environment you're delivering into, the products, the regulatory environment, whatever it might be, then they'll get the best out of the SME. So, you know, a conversation with an SME might take 5 or 10 minutes because there's mutual trust and they both understand the topic. Whereas if you fill a change team with low skilled, you know, low knowledge people to get things across the line, then that's when it becomes very difficult, you know, in terms of engagement with operation SMEs, because, you know, these are busy people, you know, the ladies and chaps that do this work, they're really, really busy operational people. They're the kind of center of the organization, and their time is precious. So they haven't got much time to spend explaining it to people. So having that really kind of high levels of knowledge in change teams, that's where it really kind of gives you benefit.
Okay, thank you. Kath, anything to add on that point?
No, I think it's you know, we'll build on Adrian's point. I think sometimes you need different types of SMEs for different contexts. So as the journey evolves, you might find you need one particular area of depth of knowledge and expertise. And and a different one as you get to a various different stage. I think where the wheels come off these things is when you're not paying attention to the things that are emerging as the iterative journey starts to work, and recognizing that you might need one particular SME-ness at one point, and it was likely to change as the journey unfolds.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So I think it's now incumbent upon me to close this webinar down. So thank you very, very much to Adrian and Catherine for your valuable input and insight. Thank you very much for everyone for tuning in. All that's left for me to say is, John, if you're there in the background, yes, thank you very much, is to flag a couple of things with you. So we have another couple of webinars coming up. We haven't decided on a date exactly yet, but they're going to be week commencing the 7th of December. We have the third one in this series, which is, Are You Set Up for Successful Change? And we have another webinar, which is around portfolio control. So we'll be sending out the invitations to those probably over the next week or so. So please do tune in if you can. If there are any questions that you've got that we didn't answer today, or in any other way that we can help, please do get in touch, and I'm sure one of us will be able to help you, or we'll know someone that can. And of course, we'll be providing video collateral from today as well to everyone that attended. So again, thank you very much, everyone, for attending and taking part, and hopefully we'll speak to you all soon.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you very much.